Ladies, gentlemen, am I often forgotten, but certainly not by me, Extreme Invention Potions. Welcome to the channel, and welcome to another guide. This guide is another update to a video I made about 2 years ago showcasing what keybinds I used, and I noticed that it was a little bit rambly and kind of longer than it needed to be, and I've also changed my keybinds and a couple things with them, so I figured I'd go ahead and make a more concise update video showcasing how I do keybinds in RS3. So before I get into talking about my keybinds, there's a couple things I want to mention real quick, and that is, yes, there is no right or wrong way to do keybinds in RS3. It is all about personal preference. However, there's a couple rules that I think if you follow, it will make it easier for you to deal with keybinds, and that being keeping binds that you use more often closer together and on things that are not on modifiers or not hopping between modifiers. Now what I mean by this is, say on your main ability bar you have a bunch of keybinds on there, and some of them use shift, some of them use control, some of them use alt, and some use none at all. When you're using different modifiers in short strings of abilities or inputs and having to swap between them, it gets really confusing, and honestly the game's tick system and input system cannot physically keep up with something that complex. And after a while, you can get used to it, you can learn the timings of it, but it's better off to just put things together and kind of group abilities together to make it easier on yourself and make it so that the game can actually keep up with what you're doing. To give y'all a physical example, a real-world example of what I'm talking about, I go ahead and brought up my entire ability bar up on screen now, and I will explain what each of the color codings are later on when I actually go through how I have this organized. But mainly what I'm talking about is, notice how on my main ability bar they're all single inputs with no modifiers. These are all the main abilities you're going to be pressing the most often on your main bar, so I went ahead and just chose to not use any modifiers on this. If you have something that is just dead stuck in your brain as it needs to be whatever keybind it is, feel free to go for it, and if you have it completely memorized and you're fine with using it, feel free. However, this is just my recommendation. And things that use modifiers typically are in some type of string of inputs. For instance, shift 2, 3, and 4 in the bottom left, that is my bladed dive swap, and they are right next to each other, so I just hit all three at once. I kind of roll through the keybinds while holding shift and then click with my mouse, and that's how I do bladed dive. So if I use a modifier, it's usually for some type of string of inputs, or it's for inputs that don't require anything else during that time in a rotation. Another example of this would be my EOF keybinds being Shift Z, X, C, and D, and V. They're all pretty close together, and in my keybind settings, weapon spec is also Shift F. So all of those are grouped together, they're close together under a modifier. However, usually when you're swapping to an EOF, you're going to be using the EOF spec, that same global cooldown, or the upcoming global cooldown. So it's fine to keep both of those together, and you hold down shift throughout that portion so you're not double pressing keybinds. What happens is, if you're a little bit too overzealous with lifting off shift or control or alt, any of the key modifiers, what can happen is, instead of taking the input of shift plus the input, it will take just the input itself. So like, instead of shift Z, it would just take Z, which in my case would use sun instead of swapping to my G staff EOF. So it's kind of the problem with RuneScape being on a 0.6 second tick system, is it's only taking so many inputs per tick, and it kind of just shoves them all together. It's kind of janky in my opinion, and probably could use with an overhaul, but that's a discussion for another video. Just if you're doing shift modifiers or control or anything like that, I would just say keep it for strings of inputs or things that you're going to be pressing on global cooldowns anyway. Alrighty, so before we get into the nitty-gritty of how I organize keybinds and bar binding and all that fun stuff, I wanted to go ahead and talk about peripherals real quick and what exactly I'm using. So, as you can see here, my mouse is a Scimitar RGB Elite. It doesn't matter if it's the RGB Elite or a Pro. Logitech makes an offering with thumb buttons, and I believe Razer has a couple offerings as well. I don't have any experience with the Logitech or Razer mice. There's probably some other ones. I mean, there's probably a half dozen companies at this point producing MMO mice and having some type of software with it. I use this Corsair ones, they seem to hold up well. I do have slightly larger hands than usual, but I've gotten used to this mouse over time, and it works pretty well for me. As far as keyboards go, I'm just using a standard 10-key keyboard. There's nothing really special with it. It's a rose will. It has, I think, cherry MX blue switches. Switches don't matter, just whatever your preference is as far as that is concerned. If you're using a membrane keyboard, that's perfectly fine as well. There's nothing really wrong there. As long as you can press the keys and they register in the game, that's all that matters. So as far as my profile is set up here, if we just go into my profile, I remember how to do this. There it is. Go into actions. I just have everything set up as an individual key. So in this software, you can go ahead and set remap keys or remap keystrokes, and they're just typing keys on a keyboard. So if I go ahead and bring up my program here that I usually use on stream to show my keyboard inputs, and I start pressing the different thumb buttons I have, they're just individual typing keys that would be on the keyboard anyway. And what this allows you to do is to control things like weapon switches and overhead prayers on your thumb while you're doing abilities and other things on the right hand. The coordination does take a little bit of getting used to. There's a little bit of muscle memory in learning how to use thumb buttons, but it's nothing that's really all too difficult. You know, within a week or so, you'll be off to the races using thumb buttons as well. Now, I'm not going to be discussing, you know, anything in terms of macros or anything more than one-to-one direct inputs. If you guys want me to make a separate video discussing my opinions on that, feel free to leave it in the comments in the video. But personally, I use everything on a one-to-one setup, and they're just all here. And I keep the 12 thumb buttons here for weapon switches. Like these two here are my main hand and offhand. This is my two hand. This is usually a flank or another weapon switch, lunging. These are kind of reserved for either random switches or spells, usually gloves or something like that, or maybe a stalled ability. This is usually defender or chin, and then these four right here, 3, 6, 9, and 2, this is deflect mage, range, melee, and soul split. So I'm constantly going between these for soul split flicking, and that's how it kind of works. As far as the top two keybinds go, this one I use for Spiritual Prayer or Blessed Flask, and then this top one here is Target Cycle, and that's what I use those two for. I don't use middle click really for anything in the scroll. Actually, middle click is just for moving the camera. I don't use WASD or arrow key for the like in-game camera movement. I don't use key inputs for that. I just use middle click to then like move around with the mouse, and that's what moves the camera around for me. Other than that, you don't need an MMO mouse to play this game. You know, you could easily just have your hands set up. Let me bring up no board again. Instead of having your pinky on shift and using kind of a traditional WASD, or having your hands set on Q through V in kind of like this box, you could shift over one or two, and then you have access to more keys in a relatively easy to use or easy to reach position, and you could just get used to that over time, like having your index finger resting on H, or maybe even J, somewhere in this area, and then you can easily reach all of these keys over here pretty easily, and over here as well as the numbers and F keys. Just whatever works for you. Personally though, I use an MMO mouse. I keep everything one-to-one. It's pretty simple, and I just use the keyboard. I'll go over my the keybinds themselves, what exactly they are back on the other screenshot. I'll go over specifically what my keybinds are later on in the video, and talking why I chose them, but I just wanted to go over peripherals and how I have my mouse set up real quick. Alright, so now we're going to be taking a look at my on-screen action bars and how I have them organized and set up. So I have the main action bar and all the secondary available on-screen bars, the secondary ones, as well as I do keep my spells near them just to make spell swapping a bit easier. This is all located kind of in the bottom center of my interface. And I went ahead and color-coded my on-screen bars as well as the actual action bars that's set on them and switch between on all the different bars, and I just have everything kind of color-coded. So the main action bar is the one that has like your HP, your adrenaline, your prayer and whatnot, and I do use the figures from this bar more so than anything I'm going to be seeing in like the 3D world render. The reason I use the HP and whatnot here rather than looking at my character is the HP here updates every single tick, so does the prayer drain and whatnot. Funny enough, the prayer drain here is a nice tick counter, so it's always going to be draining consistently every game tick, so you can use this to count ticks for certain ability combos or for cooldowns or certain specs and whatnot. And the HP bar that is above your character in game, that only updates every time you take auto attack damage. So you could be set there red barred and then have healed up, 3,000-4,000 HP from a big a dren dump or something like that, and it'll still show you red barred in game even though you've gone from like 1 to 4,000 or 5,000 health. So I always use this HP bar specifically, but I digress. So the main ability bar, this only rotates between my main abilities. So combat style specific for two-hand and dual wield, being that I do use different bars for these different types of weapons because they have unique abilities. For instance, you have G-Conk and Sonic Wave for magic, you have Needle Strike and MDS for range, and you have things like Cleave and Decimate for melee. Now, obviously, there's more abilities like this. However, those are just some examples. And I have it set up. I'll talk about bar binding a little bit later and explain how that works. But for now, I'm just talking about what bars kind of go where. And I have the main ability bar in the center. If you prefer the main ability bar up on the top and you want all the secondary ones on the bottom, feel free. This is kind of where you can take some creative liberty and kind of organize this how you want. But the thing I want to point out is the main bar and then the bottom right bar, so the red and the gold. Those are the only two that change with different combat styles. Everything else is pretty much constant, but I do it for organizational purposes. So the bottom left is always going to have things like my prayer source, some bound defensives, and other kind of panic buttons such as Vitpot or shield dome in its place, so I'm not bringing a Vitpot. And it also has my overheads and bladed dive. Those will always pretty much stay the same, and I keep them over there, and they almost never change. It's just, it makes it nice so you're not having to change, like say bladed dive swaps if you have different offhands for different presets, or for hybrid you're just using the Leng swords or whatnot. It's nice to have it there so you only have to change it on one bar. That's also why on the green bar or the utility bar, my food is there, so I'm not having to change it on, several different ability bars. Because if I had food on the main bar and I have 6 different bars, that's a lot of different slots you're taking up on your action bars or potential action bars for potential binds. So I keep things that are constantly going to be changing dependent on what I'm doing in those areas. The bottom right bar is all of my thumb buttons, as well as a couple constants that never change. Weapon switches are there, and other things like either boot swaps or glove swaps or anything of the sort will also go down there, as well as I put my EOFs. Now, a lot of people I know don't keybind their EOFs, they just click from the inventory. However, I found it very helpful to have my EOFs down where my weapon swaps are, because I didn't really have too many other weapon swaps that I needed. I know some people like to put their bladed dive bind on this bar. I think it's a little bit of a waste of space, being that it could just set on a different bar and it's always pretty much going to be the same, or it's not going to be different weapons per combat style to bladed dive. However, you will have combat style specific EOFs, and I found it very nice for having 3 to 4 binds there, being Shift, Z, X, C, and D. Those are the 4 kind of EOF binds I have, because I don't think any combat style will ever really use more than 4 EOFs. And so when you're doing hybrid, if you say, you have 8 EOFs or something ridiculous in your inventory, the binds will already be there working for you. And since we have 14 slots per action bar, I went ahead and put in the EOF spec there just to kind of keep it organized, and I put Vuln Bomb down there, although anything else that's always going to be the same, like Wars, Retreat, Teleport, or something like that. Something else could go in that slot as well. Now, the bar in blue I have labeled as hybrid, and that's usually what it is, because most bosses these days that I'm doing involve some type of hybrid setup, or more than 2 combat styles. 2 or more combat styles, I should say. However, I call this bar also kind of like my workspace, where if I'm not using hybrid, if I'm just doing some style specific stuff, this is where I'll go ahead and put in any boss specific keybinds that I need. Say I need to keybind some extra defensives, or I need to put in some other strings of inputs for something, like if I'm doing some type of tick setup or whatever you have it there. This is where I will usually put those kind of miscellaneous or not as frequently used binds. They're not universal, they're very much boss specific. That's where these are going to go. Also, I think at some point the bar 13 through 15, I don't use those action bars right now. However, I think I'm going to just go ahead and reserve those three for some different setups on boss specific things. So the action bar is already there and I can just kind of re-keybind. That's what I think I'm going to do with those. However, this is just my general layout, so to speak, for action bars and whatnot. And now I'm going to go ahead and talk about the keybinds that I use specifically. So the actual keybinds that I use, I'm going to go ahead and talk about kind of my thought process and using them and how I organized them and kind of all the whole theory behind it, so to speak. So my main action bar is all close together kind of inputs, except for action bar 13 and 14. That's kind of I've been playing EOC since it basically is released, and back then we didn't have slot 13 and 14. We had quick action slots. They were really useless, so Jagex ended up just giving us 2 extra action slots, and now we have 14 spots on our bars. Just a quick little fun fact there. So my original thought process was to be able to always have my pinky resting on shift and control and use my ring, middle, and pointer finger to easily hit any of my main key binds. And the binds I'm using is Q through V and kind of a 4x3 or 3x4, however you want to look at it, kind of box formation to be able to just easily press inputs and use the modifiers with them if I need to. Now with the main bar inputs, I definitely prefer to not have anything here that I'm pressing a lot under some type of modifier. Modifiers I specifically save for defensives or other utility items or things of that sort. Anything that I just need to press and need it to go down reliably, I always try and keep those on just standard keyboard inputs. This game, although it usually works fine and I don't have any problems, I do find modifier usage to be a little bit inconsistent sometimes if you're just like panicking, pressing a bunch of stuff. Best thing to do in this game obviously is to not panic, but if you're kind of panicking and running through something and end up spamming inputs, which you kind of have to do in this game sometimes. I personally do press my inputs multiple times instead of just once because I don't exactly trust the servers on this game. The servers are quite outdated, especially if the world population gets to anywhere close to 200 or over, and input drops do happen. That's just kind of the nature, though, of playing a big multiplayer game online. Anyways, I digress. So on the last 2 slots for N and M specifically, these are kind of ultimate or parts of strings of abilities. So for magic, for example, I have Dedo and Tsunami over there. So what I'll end up doing is, this is kind of an older tactic where Tsunami was used at, I believe it was Telos for 999s way back in the day when we would kill minions because we didn't have the damage. So what I would do is I would end up moving my hand over and then press N with my middle finger and then hit auto, which is G, and then N, and then M. So it's kind of just like 3 inputs in 1 tick. I just move my hand over to hit that, and I used to have things on like K and L and J for other kind of strings of inputs like G staffing before EOFs came into game and whatnot. So I've just kind of kept those there. I don't really have any, personally, I don't have any problems with reaching to any of those keybinds. Personally, I have kind of larger hands, so I don't really have a problem hitting Shift I, K, and less than. I can hit those if I need to, but I don't really ever use them because it is kind of a stretch in the middle of like bossing and whatnot, so I try not to. However, just moving my hand over to hit those binds is usually not too big of a deal. Now, as far as my thumb buttons are concerned, this is where I've picked keyboard inputs that are on the kind of the extreme side of the keyboard, moving over to things like insert, delete, home, end, page up, page down, Some of the other things like forward slash, backslash, apostrophe, or colon, or other things like this, the comma. These are inputs that I'm not really going to be hitting too much with my left hand, so I went ahead and reserved those for thumb buttons. Now, the only reason I do have F1 and F3 there as thumb buttons is I also like to press them on the keyboard itself with my left hand. So F2 has always been my shield, and T has always been my res. So it's always just been natural for me when I reach up and hit F2, my pointer finger always ends up landing on T just from muscle memory. And that's how I used to res. And when I was using dual or two-hand weapons back in the day, because weapon switching really wasn't too much of a thing, I had F1 there just to be my wand or my main hand of whatever style I'm using. And it just made sense to me then, and I always made F3 my offhand equip so I could just hit that right after and get back off to the races, because back then I didn't have an MMO mouse. This was a much later addition to my peripheral setup. As far as using things like EOFs and whatnot are concerned, I kind of mentioned this before, but I'll go over it briefly again. I save modifiers for either, on global cooldown inputs that don't require you to lift off and hit anything else. They're just, you press that input, you're only using that ability or a piece of equipment that game tick, you're not really doing too many other things. Or in this case with EOFs, you can hold down shift and then hit Z and V, X and V, or C and V, or D and V as kind of a two-string input, and just hold down shift through the GCD flash and it'll go off just fine, and you're not going to accidentally proc like a rack or a G-conk or anything like that. So I will save modifiers for things like that. However, I'm not the biggest fan of modifiers in general. As far as other things are concerned, I do always have my auto keys bound being G and B. Even if I'm not using magic, they just stay on there. If I was range camping, I would probably end up putting different Pernix quivers in there, or if I'm meleeing, honestly, I'm not even sure what I'd put in there. Maybe like a pocket slot swap, or maybe a helm swap or something. I'm not exactly sure what I would do there. But those are kind of open binds, but I always keep them as auto attacks, being that when 4-ticking, it's really easy to just move your pointer finger from F over to G and then hit it in combo with any of the main ability bars. So you can just kind of easily key roll through and hit like GV for auto G-conk or GF for auto wild magic in this case. It's a really easy way. The key is right next to all the other abilities, and it makes it super easy to learn something like 4-tick instead of having it on something kind of out of the way or not so much, it's not so easy. I would not put auto attacks on modifiers at all. I used to do a really backwards setup a long time ago where I had shift modifiers for my main hand, auto attack, and dual wield, and I had like defensives on my thumb buttons and stuff. It was a really backwards setup, and I don't recommend doing that at all. If you're gonna learn 4-tick, or learn how to do other things like that, or just do things that involve more than one input per GCD or per game tick, then I would go ahead and keep all of those things off of modifiers or on the same string of modifiers, because if you're trying to 4-tick with everything on shift modifiers, but your main abilities are not, the timing is very specific and very obnoxious, especially with server delay and lag, so I would just not recommend it at all. So now I'm just going to go over the last couple strings that I have as far as abilities and other strings of inputs are concerned. On my hybrid bar, it's just all of my thumb buttons except with a shift or a control modifier. So what I'll end up doing is just mash down shift or mash down control and then just roll my thumb over all of my the bottom 8 thumb buttons on my mouse, and it'll take care of the entire swap. So I could in theory do an 8-way swap if I needed to, but there's no need to be doing 8 ways in RS3 because most of the time the hybrid glove slot, which is Cinderbanes or Death Touch Brace, is going to be your best bet at those bosses. And so it's a really simple way to keep a hybrid setup going on a 1-to-1 setup, like a 1-to-1 input setup, and you can just hold control, run right through it, swap over to your melee, and then get off to the races with that. And then to swap back to magic, you just hold shift, run your thumb over your thumb buttons, and you're good to go. Other things such as bladed dive, I have them on shift 2, 3, and 4, so it's just easy to kind of key roll through those real quick, and then left click. Shift left click is not any type of input in this game, so you'll always left click no matter if you're holding down shift or not. And shift G and B has always been my surge and escape since the beginning of time. So with the bladed dive being on shift as well, any type of mobility movement or something like that, it's really easy to just kind of dart around the instance holding shift and then doing whatever you need to do. A couple of quick final notes on the food area. I do have eat food bound, just makes life easier, so I'm not having to rebind for blubbers or rebind for solid foods like sailfish or sailfish soup. And having these on the bar that never swaps, which is my utility bar, this bar never changes from any type of bar binding. It means you only have to change it on one action bar. You know, you just swap your food over real quick. You're not having to swap over like on 2 or 3 separate action bars based on combat styles. It makes life a lot simpler. Other than that, that's pretty much about it. If you have any questions about the keybinds that I use specifically, why I'm using one or the other, go ahead and leave it in the comments below, but I'm going to go ahead and move on. So now I'm going to go ahead and get into the topic of bar binding and how it works. Now, the interface is slightly confusing at first, but once you kind of understand the general concept, then it's a really simple thing. All you're doing with bar binding is having certain ability bars, any action bar or ability bar, 1 through 15, go to a specific combat style. Now you can break this down to just a combat style in general, being magic, melee, or range, or you can break it down into more specifics such as dual wield weapons or two-hand weapons. So if I go ahead on my thumb button, press my two-hand bind, then you can see my action bar changes here, and I have different abilities on here for two-hand specific stuff. And same thing with my dual wield, but I can switch between these, and I can have things like cleave and decimate under the same keybind, so you just press E again, and it's really simple for weapon switching. So to set up bar binding, all you're going to have to do is press escape to bring up your options menu. You're going to click settings, go to gameplay, and in the combat and action bar section, it is its own designated subsection of action bar binding. Now here, these two boxes are for bank presets, so if you load a bank preset, it'll swap the bars automatically for you. I like this for when loading a preset. If I'm doing anything, it just makes it a bit nicer, and you have to just make sure that you have action bar binding enabled. And now you get into the different setups. So there are 15 in total because there are 15 action bars. Now, just think of these as kind of like individual statements. That's all you're doing. They're like little mini presets to remember things. So for instance here, I have my main action bar, so this is setup number 2. This can be in any setup, you can do this in any order. If you want to have it matching your ability bar names here, so it's all nice and organized, you can. Or if you're kind of disorganized like I am, usually you just kind of run down the laundry list and make sense from there. So all you have to do is to go to an individual one, any of these will work, and then you want to select first the type of action bar. So the main action bar is the one with your prayer and your health and all that stuff, and then you can pick from any of the other secondary bars. Now, which bar is on screen, you'll be able to find here in action bars. If you go to additional action bar 1, 2, 3, and 4, it'll give you the names here, and that'll tell you which one you're going to be changing. So right now, bar number 10 is additional action bar 1, and so that's this one right here. And so I'll be able to use that information to go back into here, and let me see, where is my secondary? Those are all main action bar. It's main. So here it says additional action bar 1, that is to select this one. So whichever bar, you can have any secondary bar set up to switch based on combat style. I personally just do the bottom right because that's where my thumb buttons have always been for me personally. But anyways, that's how you figure out which action bar type. So if it's main one, it's going to change the one with all the numbers and stuff. And if you select additional bar 1, 2, 3, or 4, it's any of the 4 here. And you can, again, use the information you have here to figure out which one it is talking about. So after that, all you have to do is then pick a style. So I have melee 2-hand here, and then you can name the preset as well, just for organization's sake. If you have your ability bars named already, then you can just pick it here for the preset name and then match it up easily. So it is kind of nice if you already have these labeled. So then anytime I press any melee dual wield weapon, doesn't matter if it's the T95, a spear, a bronze spear, it doesn't matter what it is, any melee 2-hand class of weapon will automatically bring up your action bar for dual wield melee. And then you can go ahead and set this up for 2-hand and dual wield. Now, what I will say is if you want to have a dedicated bar for thumb buttons, how I would set it up is to have the 2-hand and dual wield option for the main bar. And then what I have is for any magic or any melee range or any melee, the any melee style. So it doesn't matter if you put on a dual wield or 2-hand weapon. What happens is anytime any class of weapon in one of those 3 comes up, my thumb buttons here will be for that combat style. So if I swap over to range, then my 2-hand button is always my 2-hand button. And that's how it is. Or if I go to magic, my dual wield is always the same, my 2-hand's always the same. All of these inputs will be the same regardless of combat style. It makes learning your inputs much easier. So just go ahead and set this all up for however your bars are set up, and I hope this helped a little bit. Another quick note I wanted to make is if you want to name your action bars, all you have to do is right click this cogwheel on your main action bar, go to action bar settings, and scroll down here, and under change action bar preset names, you can just then change which bar you want to each one and then just name them accordingly. Ladies, gentlemen, and I did not forget about you extreme invention potions, thank you very much for watching the video. If you have any questions, feel free to leave it in the comments below and I'll do my best to respond. And if you're not already subscribed to the channel, please consider subscribing. It helps out more than you know. We're trying to get to 1,000 subscribers and keep pushing from there. So also, if you know anyone that this video might be helpful for, if there's someone perhaps in your clan or a friend's chat or something that is struggling a little bit with keybinds and you think this video will help them out, feel free to share this video around with anyone that you may think needs the help. Anyways, I'm Car Guy. Have a wonderful morning, evening, afternoon, nighttime, whatever it is, wherever you are. I'll see you next time for the next video. Peace.